Section 5 of Lavender Lit 101. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fragments from Igor Stravinsky and the Russian Ballet by Jean Cocteau. Translated from the French by Rollo H. Myers. I prefer, myself, a talented childhood which grows up in bad surroundings, takes wrong turnings, spends itself futilely, and at length suddenly discovers its error in time to escape the consequences, to a childhood which makes its first faux pas on correct paths, and which progresses normally, holding out no hope of startling developments. I accept the early flame of genius, sometimes sublime, which dies down again unless the prodigy, combining wisdom with genius, retires in time under some pretext or other. No, in discipline and bad taste, those characteristics of youth preserve qualities which exist in embryo, and which are delivered in due course painfully, delicately, gradually, by spade work, like a buried Venus. For this reason, do not regret your mistakes, even public and notorious ones, heavy drags though they be, and which do not alleviate the fatigues of the journey towards the left. One turns round, takes a sponge down, looks to see where one has come from, and is astonished. The chief stumbling block people put in the way of this Herculean task is ingratitude. One passes through many milieus in order to attain a relative solitude, and these milieus reproach one with having shared their table, and with having cleared out on the quiet. The result is the heart suffers much from a pilgrimage which the world commonly attributes to egoism, disorder, and versatility. And the flower maidens! Amongst the most recent flower maidens, the most maidenly and the most flowery, I class the Russian ballet. I had a presentiment that I should have to find an excuse for my enthusiasm for this Barnum, a last scruple before clearing out on the quiet. It was in 1910. Nijinsky was dancing the Spectre de la Rose. Instead of going to see the piece, I went to wait for him in the wings. There it was really very good. After embracing the young girl, the Spectre of the Rose hurls himself out of the window and comes to earth amongst the stage hands, who throw water in his face and rub him down like a boxer. What a combination of grace and brutality! I shall always hear that thunder of applause. I shall always see that young man, smeared with grease paint, gasping and sweating, pressing his heart with one hand and holding on with the other to the scenery, or else fainting on a chair. Afterwards, having been smacked and douched and shaken, he would return to the stage and smile his acknowledgments. It was in this semi-obscurity, under the moonlight of the limelights, that I met Stravinsky. Stravinsky was then finishing Petrushka. He described it to me in the casino at Monte Carlo, astonishing those people whom nothing can astonish by his gesticulations, his grimaces, and jewelry fit for a Negro king. Petrushka was given in Paris on June 13th, 1911. I remember the private rehearsal at the Châtelet. The work which, today, gives off its whole aroma, at that time withheld it, so much so that it displeased the public. The dilettanti, used to clichés, were unable to follow a synthesis of the soul of the Russian people, whose melancholy is not expressed in a whine, and which goes straight from beginning to end, like a drum roll. One or two specialists recognized the master, and gradually the concert halls consecrated Petrushka. Petrushka then was recognized, firstly on account of the folklore it contained, secondly as a defense against still newer things. For it is the public's way to hobble from one work to another, always one behind, adopting what precedes in order to use it to blame what is going to follow, and never keeping to the page, as the expression goes. We saw very little of Stravinsky until the famous première of the Sacre du Printemps. The Sacre du Printemps was given in May 1913, in a new theatre, untarnished by time, too comfortable and too cold for a public used to emotions at close quarters in the warmth of red velvet and gold. I do not for a moment think that the Sacre would have met with a more polite reception on a less pretentious stage, but this luxurious theatre seemed, at first glance, symbolic of the misunderstanding which was confronting a decadent public with a work full of strength and youth, a tired public reposing amidst Louis XVI garlands, Venetian gondolas, luxurious divans, and cushions of an Orientalism for which the Russian ballet must be held responsible. Under such conditions one digests, as it were, in a hammock, dozing. The really new is driven away like a fly. It is disturbing. The natural trend of bad taste is already marked. But since 1912 a false audacity, tempting some and mistaken by others, hating both alike, for true audacity, has taken possession of innumerable categories of fashionable aesthetes. Dilettanti and precious women thought themselves the thing, and a class made its appearance in the world belonging to no class, neither that of respectable bad taste, for which it was most fitted, nor the one of new ideas, happily out of reach of its attainment. The provinces out-provincialized in the very heart of Paris. Let us recall the theme of the Sacre. First tableau. The prehistoric youth of Russia are engaged in springtide games and dances. They worship the earth, and the wise elder reminds them of the sacred rites. Second tableau. These simple men believe that the sacrifice of a young girl chosen from amongst all her peers is necessary in order that spring may recommence. She is left alone in the forest. The ancestors come out of the shadows like bears and form a circle. They inspire the chosen one with the rhythm of a long, drawn-out convulsion. When she falls dead, the ancestors draw near, receive her body, and raise it towards heaven. This theme, so simple, so devoid of symbolism, today seems to hold a symbol. I see in it the prelude to the war. It would perhaps be of interest to trace the part played by each of the collaborators in the ensemble of this work. Stravinsky, musician; Roerich, painter; and Nijinsky, choreographer. We were then, musically, in the heyday of Impressionism. Everyone was trying to find a new way of being vague and indistinct. Then suddenly, in the midst of these charming ruins, grew up the Stravinsky tree. When all is said and done, the Sacre is still a Fauvist work, an organized Fauvist work. Gauguin and Matisse pay homage to it. But if the backwardness of music as compared to painting prevented the Sacre of necessity from coinciding exactly with other disturbing elements, it none the less contributed an indispensable dynamitic force. Moreover, it must not be forgotten that Stravinsky's unbroken collaboration with Diaghilev's company and his attentiveness to his wife in Switzerland kept him at a distance from the center of things. His audacity was, therefore, quite gratuitous. In brief, the work, as it stands, was and is a masterpiece, a symphony impregnated with a wild sadness of primitive earth, camp and farmyard noises, fragments of melodies emerging from the depths of time, animal paintings, profound upheavals, the Georgics of a prehistoric age. Certainly Stravinsky had studied Gauguin's canvases, but in the process of transformation the weak decorative register became a colossus. At that time I was not au courant with the more trivial factions of the left, and thanks to my ignorance I was able to enjoy the Sacre to the full, away from the petty schisms and narrow formulae which condemn free values and too often serve to mask a lack of spontaneity. Roerich is a mediocre painter. On the one hand he designed costumes and scenery for the Sacre which were in keeping with the work; on the other hand he enfeebled it by the softness of his accents. There remains Václav Nijinsky. I will show you a phenomenon. When he is at home, that is to say, in the palace hotels where he bivouacs, this young Ariel frowningly examines folios and revolutionizes the grammar of gesticulation. Badly informed, his modern models are not of the best. He makes use of the salon d'automne. Too familiar with the triumph of grace, he rejects it. He seeks systematically the opposite to that to which he owes his fame. In order to escape from old formulae, he hems himself in with new ones. But Nijinsky is a moujik, a Rasputin. He carries in him that fluid which stirs crowds and despises the public, whom he does not refuse to gratify. Like Stravinsky, he metamorphoses into strength the weakness of whatever he derives his inspiration from. By means of all these atavisms, this absence of culture, this meanness, this humanity, he escapes the German danger, the system which desiccates a Reinhardt. I have heard the Sacre again without the dances. I ask to see them again. In my recollection, impulse and order are equally balanced in them as in the orchestra. The fault lies in the parallelism of music and movement, in their want of play, of counterpoint. We had the proof that the same chord repeated often tires the ear less than the frequent repetition of the same gesture tires the eye. Laughter was caused by a monotony, as of automata, rather than by the abruptness of the attitudes, and by the abruptness of the attitudes rather than by the polyphony. The choreographer's work may be divided into two parts. One part dead, e.g., keeping the feet motionless, merely with the idea of contradicting the traditional pose of the danseuse, toes out; and one part alive, e.g., the storm, and that dance of the chosen one, foolish and naive, the dance of an insect, of a hind fascinated by a boa, of a factory explosion, in fact, the most stupefying spectacle I ever remember having seen in the theater. These different elements formed, then, an ensemble, which was both homogeneous and heterogeneous, and what shortcomings there may have been as regards detail were volatilized and eradicated by sheer force of temperament. Thus we made the acquaintance of this historic work in the midst of such an uproar that the dancers could no longer hear the orchestra, and had to keep time to the rhythm which Nijinsky, stamping and shouting, was beating in the wings. After this sketch of what was going to happen on the stage, let us pass through the little iron door to the auditorium. It is packed. A practiced eye could discern there all the material for a scandal. A fashionable public, décolleté, decked with pearls, aigrettes, and ostrich plumes, and, rubbing shoulders with tulle gowns and tail-coats, the jackets and headbands and conspicuous garments of that species of aesthete who acclaims no matter what novelty in season and out of season, through detestation of the dress circle, the unintelligent applause of the former being more insufferable than the sincere hisses of the latter. Add to these the musicians of the feverish school, a handful of moutons de Panurge, hesitating between public opinion and the admiration one ought to entertain for the Russian ballets. And, without insisting further, mention ought to be made of the 1,000 varieties of snobism, super-snobism, anti-snobism, which would require a whole chapter to themselves. A feature of our audience ought to be recorded, namely, the absence, with one or two exceptions, of the young painters and their masters; an absence due, as I afterwards learnt in the case of the former, to their ignorance of these functions to which Diaghilev, to whom they were as yet unknown, did not invite them; in the case of the latter, to social prejudices. This condemnation of luxury, which Picasso professes like a cult, has its merits and demerits. I fling myself upon this cult as upon an antidote. But it may be that it restricts the horizon of certain artists, who avoid contact with luxury from motives of envious hatred rather than conviction. In any case, Montparnasse is still ignorant of the Sacre du Printemps, and the Sacre du Printemps, played on the orchestra at the Concert Manteau, had the same bad reputation amongst artists of the left as the Russian ballets. And Picasso heard Stravinsky for the first time with me in Rome in 1917. Let us now return to the theater in the Avenue Montaigne, while we wait for the conductor to rap his desk and the curtain to go up on one of the noblest events in the annals of art. The audience behaved as it ought to. It revolted straight away. People laughed, booed, hissed, imitated animal noises, and possibly would have tired themselves out before long had not the crowd of aesthetes and a handful of musicians, carried away by their excessive zeal, insulted and even roughly handled the public in the loge. The uproar degenerated into a free fight. Standing up in her loge, her diadem awry, the old Countess de P flourished her fan and shouted, scarlet in the face, "It's the first time for 60 years that anyone's dared to make a fool of me." The good lady was sincere. She thought there was some mystification. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Stravinsky, Nijinsky, Diaghilev and I piled into a taxi and drove to the Bois de Boulogne. No one spoke. The night was fresh and agreeable. We recognized the first trees by the smell of the acacias. When we had reached the lakes, Diaghilev, enveloped in opossum furs, began to mutter in Russian. I felt Stravinsky and Nijinsky listening, and when the driver lit the lamps I saw that there were tears on the impresario's face. He went on muttering, slowly and indefatigably. "What is it?" I asked. "Pushkin." Again there was a long silence. Then Diaghilev stammered out a short sentence, and the emotion of my two companions seemed so acute that I could not refrain from interrupting in order to know the reason. "It is hard to translate," said Stravinsky, "really very hard, too Russian. It means roughly, vas-tu faire un tour aux îles? Yes, that's it. It's a very Russian expression because, you know, in our country one goes to the islands in the same way as we are going to the Bois de Boulogne tonight, and it was in going to the islands that we conceived the Sacre du Printemps." It was the first time the scandal had been alluded to. We came back at dawn. You cannot imagine the state of softness and nostalgia of these men, and whatever Diaghilev may have done since, I shall never forget his great, wet face in the cab, reciting Pushkin in the Bois de Boulogne. It is from this meeting in the cab that our real friendship with Stravinsky dates. He went back to Switzerland. We corresponded. I had the idea of David and went to join him at Leysin. An acrobat was to do the parade for David, a big spectacle which was supposed to be taking place inside. A clown who subsequently became a box, a kind of theatrical pastiche of the traveling phonograph, a modern equivalent of the Masque of the Ancients, was to sing through a megaphone the prowess of David and implore the public to enter to see the piece inside. It was, in a sense, the first sketch of parade, but uselessly complicated by the Bible and a text. It contained good and bad features. The idea was too fresh, too reactive, and I congratulate myself that circumstances saved us from committing a half blunder, worse than a blunder. For me it was a time of transformations. I was molting. I was in a state of growth. It was natural that frivolity, lack of concentration, and talkativeness should have been followed by an excessive desire for sobriety, method, and silence. Moreover, without knowing what the painter's opinion was, I realized thoroughly the antagonism between the genius of Igor and the chèvre échue atmosphere of the Russian ballets, and also the difficulty for an artist to concentrate within the limits of a frame so vast and encumbered with such elaborate accessories. But my idea was not ripe. End of Fragments from Igor Stravinsky and the Russian Ballet by Jean Cocteau. Translated from the French by Rollo H. Myers. Recording by Ben Adams.